Hello and welcome to We Never Met, the podcast where I have interesting strangers on every single week. Today we have Nat West. How are you?
Very good. How are you, Sam?
I'm good. And you are Nat West, founder and owner of Reverend Nat's Hard Cider. In my opinion, and this is my humble opinion, one of the best hard ciders, not only in Portland, but in the United States. All your ciders are awesome and delicious. You know, I actually had some of your ciders right now. I have some, if you can see it in my video.
Oh, yeah.
Product placement.
Revival Hard Apple. Very good.
Yeah, I had some last night. It's really, really good. And it's actually the first, could you call them cideries? Is that what they're called?
Yeah, like winery, cidery, brewery. Yep.
Yeah, it's the first one me and my fiance went to when we visited Portland like 2 years ago.
Well, we actually have a lot of tourists we see a lot of suitcases. I should say that we saw a lot of suitcases in our tap room prior to COVID. Sure. A lot of people would get off the plane and we'd be there first. What we really loved was being people's last stop. That was the real honor because, you know, Portland is known as a food and beverage destination, and people might spend a few days or a long weekend, eat and drink a bunch, and then, realize that they want to get something else on the way home to take back with them.
Yeah. And so before this even began, what were you doing before the cidery and like creating ciders? Like what was your career and like aspirations?
This is the second legitimate career of my life. I did IT, programming, database development, a lot of business applications prior to this. I spent 13 years doing that business, and I've now been at the cider business for about 10 years now in the cider business. So I'm very glad. It was a good move. You know, computer programming stuff is, one hard drive crash and you have nothing. Yeah. And I never had that experience. It wasn't the fear of it, but it was the ephemeral nature that you're not actually creating anything that really wanted me to get out, that really made me want to get out of that and into something more tangible.
Yeah, because I was going to ask, like, I read a little bit about why you started creating cider. There was like a surplus of apples from like a neighbor, and you basically made everything else. But my interest is more like making hard cider or making cider in general is one thing, but like sort of keeping the pursuit and making that into a business is a completely other thing. So when you started doing that, what was the interest in like creating this and learning more about it and being I mean obsessed is a strong word, but sort of like very interested in this craft? So
I made cider at home for about 6 years or so before starting the business. So there's I think there's two parts to that, two questions there. One is just like how to get into cider in the first place, and it was that apple tree that produced a ton of apples. And at the time I really enjoyed the magic. For me was, here is this, child's fruit, right? That's like, you love apples. I love apples. So, but the point is it's a fruit. It's this sort of pure natural thing. And then, you help it along a little bit, and then it becomes, the greatest vice that humans have ever really discovered. So it's that dichotomy, that difference between starting with something that really just grew up in nature and turning it into a really good time with your friends. And it's just really fascinating I was really fascinated by that process, of which humans have very little to do, really. It's all about yeast that does that work. So I started experimenting. The first cider I ever had was my own. And I think that aspect of my life is really what defines my cider business, cider making, flavors since then. So I didn't come into it with a knowledge of what cider quote unquote should be. I came into it with a love of beer, and I'm still primarily a beer drinker, but I started with sort of a home brewer's mindset. So the first yeast that I ever used was beer yeast. I've always, the second cider I ever made had hops in it. And I didn't know that was like a really weird thing. I just did it because of the beer love. So
it was almost beneficial because you didn't have any like thing in the back of your mind, like this is, even if you didn't care, is like, oh, this is what it should taste like, or this is what it should be. You just you should just go into it and do whatever you wanted.
Since the early days, as I got more and more serious, I before starting the business, I did go back and read all the literature and learn what traditional cider is, how to do it, what all the different techniques and the history of it, so that, and that process, I think, really reinforced what made it fun for me and reinforced my unique take on the product. I still love and drink a lot of traditional ciders, but it's just not the kind of ciders that I enjoy making.
Yeah. Did that change a lot for you because you have such a eclectic, I guess, library of cider books and things like that. Did it change a lot for you when you started reading about the history, like the way you made it, or did it just, I guess, open your mind to like different ways you could experiment with it?
A real cider nerd can notice traditional little elements, little snippets of tradition in my most radical, unusual ciders, for sure. So I've definitely been able to borrow from the thousands of years of tradition of cider making, and more broadly fruit fermentation in general, to make these really modern ciders, for sure. And I think that's, my favorite ciders, in fact, are traditional ciders. And I have the respect of many traditional cider makers who are very militant about what cider is and should be, because I've always approached them not as stepping on them to advance my own capitalistic ambitions. It's very much been, I love your ciders, I want to make something different. And it's really just been a reflection of Portland. There's zero chance that I would be making these kinds of ciders if I had become a drinking person not in Portland. The Portland drinking scene is so vibrant and so much innovation, from spirits to cider to wine to beer, that it's really a representation of the place that we're in, for sure.
So with that, when you did start, how did the experimentation and like development of the recipes take place? Like even for the one I just sort of held up, the Revival.
Yeah, the Revival. Yeah. I make cider for myself. I don't, see trends and jump on them. It's not, I can't wake up and go to work if that's the case. And sure. Lord knows I'm not in this for the money. So I got to really enjoy what I'm doing. I develop these flavors for my own palate. And if I like it, then I sell it. And if other people like it, then I sell more of it. Prior to coronavirus, when we had an operating tap room, we made 50 or 75, upwards of 100 different ciders in a given year. And that's just because I'm always coming up with ideas, new ingredients that I discover, other cocktails I may try. I travel a lot for the business as well, and I meet people who have different ideas, and I want to come back and do my take on those. There is just a lot of make it for me and hope to find other people who have my palate. And that certainly limits our ability to grow a bit. People don't think of us as your sort of starter cider. It's a little bit more of a developed. I have no problem if somebody drinks one of my ciders and they say that's disgusting. That to me is almost like mission accomplished, because for every person who doesn't like something, there's going to be somebody else who thinks it's amazing. I'm not saying, objectively bad ciders, but like that flavor is not for me. So, we were talking about Revival. That's our classic apple. And then, on the opposite end of the spectrum, it's got a little bit of sweetness in there. It's extremely fruity and juicy. On the opposite end of the spectrum, I have super dry ciders that have zero fruitiness in them and are, much higher alcohol and far more, I don't want to use words like sophisticated or mature, because that, because I love Revival myself, maybe meets the expectations of more experienced drinkers who are looking for something different. So we really have a cider for everybody. And that's always been a joy of mine with the tap room, is we have a flight that you can purchase of 12 ciders. And I love seeing people's score sheets. We have like a menu. You can put your own little notes in there. I love when people leave them behind sometimes. I love reading them, and they'd be like 1 star, 1 star, 1 star, 5 stars, 5 stars, 1 star, 1 star, 5 star, 5.
It's so polarizing.
Yeah. And then the person next to them has got those ratings flipped. So.
Yeah. And when you started the business, you started doing it out of your home and out of your garage. And so what were like the challenges? I mean, there had to be a ton of like basically getting all the equipment even in there and like trying to work around like such a small space.
Yeah.
what kept you going during that time? Just like your love of it and just like really wanting to make this work?
I think that goes to kind of who I am outside of the cider world. I like learning new things and doing new things. I'm not afraid of work. I'm not afraid of large projects that I don't know anything about. Whatever the topic is. And prior to this conversation with you, I was out in our new cider building, chiseling out concrete. And I've done some concrete work in my life for sure, but I like the variety of this business for sure, where I'm chiseling concrete one minute and now I'm in my best clothes talking to you.
Yeah.
So the challenges in the beginning were really just about, can I do this? Is this is it a possibility? And I got a license, federal and state license to produce alcohol, a bonded winery. Cider companies in the United States are wineries, legally in your license. So I got my basement licensed as a federally bonded winery, which is pretty wild. And that was a challenge because people hadn't really done that. It was very hard to find information about that. And there were some conflicting government regulations about whether that was even allowed. I got through all those hurdles. And the beginning of it was just, I was making cider for years, and I was making more and more cider and really enjoying sharing it with friends and neighbors. And the beginning was just, I might as well make some money off of this. And, had this small basement that I was going to do the work in, and very rapidly I sold out. I made what I thought was a year's supply, and I sold out in about 2 months. So then I thought, well, do I have a 2-month a year business or do I grow? So that was the choice, is to get out of the basement, expanded into my garage, kind of overflowed into the driveway, made sure that all my neighbors were well compensated for the loud machinery and trucks coming and going. I had a number of, there was some really stupid times for sure. There was like full size 53-foot semis pulling down I live in a totally residential neighborhood, like a city blocks, right? Yeah. Pulling down my neighborhood and hopping out and saying like, I don't know what the hell I'm doing here. I can't handle this. And I'm like, well, okay. It's okay. We'll get through this together. And just pulling the wool over on a couple of people's eyes for sure. But I was only in my basement and garage for about a year before moving out into the building that we're moving out of right now as well. So keep growing.
I might have read this about someone else and maybe thought it was you, but did you have to build a basement in your house too, just to get?
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a weird time. I had my wife and I bought a house about 16 years ago that was built in 1905, and it didn't have a foundation. It was just some wood sitting on the ground. It was completely rotted through and through. The floor, the house was tipping this way and that. Some of the wooden posts that it was built on were no longer there. It was everything above the quote unquote foundation was in good shape.
Sure.
So we lived there for a few years, and then finally had enough savings to lift the house up and pour a new foundation of it. So I also dug out a full basement. So there wasn't a basement; it was just a tiny little crawl space. And I had another company come and do the lift and the lower, but I did all the digging and all the form work and all the concrete, flat work, everything. Huge job. And that was kind of happening as I was really getting into making more and more cider for fun, for, just personal use. And then I thought, okay, so I'll put a little cidery, floor drain and, washable walls and some of the more food grade type furnishings. And then that was like the fall that I decided to start the business. So I researched more food manufacturing facility requirements, and then managed to polish off the basement cidery to be and it wasn't even a whole basement. It was just like 10 by 20, so it's a pretty small space. I managed to get that tricked out for full licensing. So it was, now when you go in there's no longer any cider making in that part of the basement, but there are some strange features of that somebody else who buys the house in however many years are going to be like, what is going on here? So
what were they doing in this room? No, that is interesting. You are literally like a jack of all trades if you could like dig out a basement and do all that stuff as well.
Yeah, I like describing that I'm like a 9 of all trades? Because I'm not really a jack. Like that's kind of a pretty high up there. But yeah, but that has been really, really, really critical to the success of this business, is the ability to, repair engines and, make really good Excel budgets and give presentations, meet bankers, chip out concrete, hire people. I can definitely do a little bit of everything. Although that does kind of get in the way as we continue to grow. I don't mind. I love getting other people to do my work for me. So I don't have a hard time letting go. I have so many things that I can do, and I always am inclined to take on a bigger workload for myself than I probably should when I have people around me.
Yeah. So when you just like get a new task, instead of like basically hiring it out, you just sort of research and figure out how to do it yourself. And that's just sort of how you are.
Yeah, it's kind of my theory. One of my sort of operating theories about being a boss, being a manager or whatever, is to figure out how to do the job yourself, and then get somebody else to do it. And I think that's it's kind of a good piece of it. I don't think that's a crutch for me, because it lets me really set the expectations and be able to provide the resources and support to whoever is doing that job. And then on the flip side, they can look at me and know that despite the fact that I will go, weeks as a carpet walker, we call them. So, as opposed to putting rubber boots on, they know that I'm still there to fix anything that comes up, or, if they're short staffed and they need me to run the canning line, I can do that. And, so it ends up staying a relatively family feeling kind of business, even though as we continue to grow.
Yeah, no, I think that's a super important thing too. I work in video production, and I always wish sometimes that the people that are managing me or directing me had experience doing it, so they would know like how much time things take, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so it's definitely I think a huge positive that's how you are owning a business.
Yeah, it's I think I'll never give that up. I'll certainly take that that aspect of my management style to my grave for sure.
So when you decided that like this is going to be a legitimate business and this is not just something that I'm going to, sell for extra money, what was the actual like, I guess, thought process and reasoning that you made that jump and were like, I'm going to do this now. This is it. What was like the turning point for you specifically?
There were kind of two moments. One was I was tiring of my IT career, just sitting in front of a computer all day. There were I would go days and days at a time without leaving my house. I worked from home, and I can be a homebody for sure, but I just was ready to move on. It was, I've never made more money. I probably will never make more money than I was making doing IT. So I probably should have stuck with that job, honestly. But it was, it was just that ready for a change. But then the actual moment, so I had been casting about trying to figure out what my next 10-year or whatever block of time would look like. And, I had these sort of building trades experience. I thought maybe I'd do something in, construction or something, carpentry. I wasn't really sure. Then I was, getting more and more into cider, making a lot of cider. And the cider industry was starting to take off. Angry Orchard hadn't been invented yet. So we're going way back. We used to actually host, my wife and I hosted open potlucks at our house every Wednesday, every week, for 5 years without missing a Wednesday. My wife and I missed a couple of Wednesdays, but the regulars would come and open up the house, and everyone would come and they'd clean up the dishes, and then they'd lock the house and head out. So it was a going concern for sure, and it was open, so we didn't know who was going to come every week. There'd be strangers, and many times I found myself talking to someone for 10 or 15 minutes, and then during the conversation, I said, "Oh, I live here. This is my house." And they're like, "Oh, okay. Nice to meet you." Mm-hmm. And so that gave me an opportunity to actually make a lot of cider and have strangers drink it and give me honest feedback. Cause it was kind of known as like, oh, they always have plenty of, I had homebrewer friends who would always keep the kegerator topped up with beer. So it was the beer and cider flowed freely. And so that was encouraging to hear strangers say this cider is really good. Mm-hmm. And then, the moment, August 10th, 2011, I was sitting at the table pretty drunk with some of my friends, homebrewer friends, and we were drinking a commercially made cider. And that cider came from an orchard that I also got apples from. So it was a real direct kind of moment. And and we were all astounded at how bad that cider was, the commercially bought one. And I said, pretty drunk, I said, no, screw this. I'm going to start the cider company. I got to do it for the sake of the apples. These apples are being wasted.
Right.
And that the next day I incorporated the business. I had already had the name Reverend Nat's Hard Cider. It's kind of my wife's idea to, you're making home brew and you put something on the bottles. And so I was putting Reverend Nat in the bottles. So I just incorporated it as Reverend Nat's. And then, I woke up the next day and realized, I guess I'm actually going to do this thing. So.
Yeah, I mean, you basically had like 5 years of sort of market research that was like coming to you almost, with people like strangers tasting it and telling you how it is.
Yeah, and so I think that a lot of people come to me for advice about starting a cider company, and the strongest piece of advice I have is don't do it. And everyone laughs, but then I'm like, no, I'm totally serious. Don't do it. Stick with your bank job. But if they're dumb enough to want to continue to do it, like I was, then my advice is figure out how to make really good cider consistently in your sleep before trying to start a business, because you're just going to have so many problems and you're going to have to learn so much. And the last thing you want to be doing is putting out sub-quality, substandard, liquid that someone's going to drink. You want to know that your liquid is always ready and delicious. So it's pretty hard. It takes years to figure that out, both technically, but also as far as like your particular style of cider. So I had that out of the way for sure.
Yeah. Is that something that's feasible? I know there's a lot of like home brewers that do it just like in a room in their house or a segment of their room. Is that feasible for cider making too? Like, could someone just be like, I want to sort of try it out and see what happens? Or is it like the equipment too large to try?
No. So it's a lot like making beer in about the same amount of space. Beer, traditionally you start with whole grains. And so it takes up room to actually do the brewing. You have a brew kettle and you got to make it hot and you got to stir it like a witch over a cauldron. And it's like takes a little bit more room than it does to actually make cider. What takes up a lot of room is making apple juice from apples. And a lot of folks think that they need to start from apples in order to, be honest or true or whatever. And that's certainly how I started. I pressed everything that I would ferment. We've totally progressed beyond that. We're making so much cider here that we could not possibly press enough apples. So we rely on a large juice processor to bring us tanker trucks full of apple juice. And so there's no shame in starting from apple juice. And if you start from apple juice, you need very, very little room in order to, make a drinkable product. However, I will say that it is extremely easy to make alcoholic apple juice, and it is very hard to make delicious cider. Unlike beer making, where if you get a beer kit for your birthday or Christmas or whatever, and you follow a recipe, and you're a decent cook already, and you follow a recipe, the recipe will make it turn out, and it'll taste like whatever beer it's supposed to taste like. So there's a lot of opportunity for creativity on both sides, but I think beer is a little bit more forgiving for newbies to make something delicious.
Yeah. So when you were starting out in like creating ciders and like giving it to your neighbors, was it all like consistently one style or one type, or did you just experiment all over the board, sort of how you do now with your business?
There was less opportunity for me to experiment at home because the volumes that we were going through wasn't amazing. We would go through, a 5-gallon keg in, 2 or 3 weeks. So there wasn't an opportunity to produce lots of different things. Yeah, no, there wasn't actually a lot of innovation, honestly, on the home scale. Well, there wasn't as much as we do now. Every season at home, I would try different things and I would try different tactics, but there was a limit to how much volume I could produce, store, and then, drink. So yeah, I would probably make 3 or 4 or 5 different things a year, which probably actually in retrospect is a lot, considering most folks who make cider just make kind of one or two a year. And I would regularly experiment with different yeasts and different fermentation temperatures and different ingredients. And now we're making, a lot more than that.
Yeah, because I was going to ask if it made it like harder to hone your skills if you were sort of trying all different things, or it made it easier on you eventually, you know?
I think the reality is there's just, unless you have a tap room where you have willing customers ready to drink whatever you make, it can be difficult to just constantly experiment because there's no outlet for all that.
Sure.
So I think there was enough, I had enough uniqueness under my belt after making cider for a few years. I had enough unique experiences under my belt to know that I could go into my first year of professional cider making with, a recipe book that's going to be, a decent amount of variety. So that first year, actually, as a commercial cider maker, I only made 4 ciders, maybe 5. And the following year was similar. And then after like about 1 year in our commercial cidery, the floodgates pretty much opened and we started producing huge numbers of different ciders every year.
Yeah. Do you think there was like a specific, or was there a specific cider that like sort of put your business on the map, or was it just sort of the, like, I guess, identity of your company in general that was like, people like talked about the willingness to experiment and try different things and sort of a more unique and creative approach?
It was this one cider that was super unique and put us on the map as the people who are kind of like, whoa. And that was a cider called Hallelujah Hopricot. And that was the second cider that I ever sold commercially. It was hops. It had Cascade hops in it. It was dry hopped like you would make an IPA. And it had a Belgian Saison yeast for the fermentation. And I used the wit beer spices, coriander, bitter orange peel, grains of paradise, and star anise. So it's very, very inspired by European beers, the wit beer and Belgian Saison, and had a decent load of Cascade hops in it, and it was finished with some apricot juice. So it was like, you read the ingredient list and you'd be like, what the hell? And then you drink it and it's, the comments would be, we would get comments like, oh, you should make this into a perfume. And you should make this into, candles. And it was just this magical kind of moment of things coming together. And it wasn't that cider was not the result of a ton of experimentation. It was one of those, oh my God, moments where we just poured 2 things together, 2 different experiments together, apricot. We had this apricot wit, and then we had a Belgian hopped, and we poured them together and it was like, this is amazing. So, and that cider, I dutifully drove around in my, my beater pickup truck and went off to a bunch of bars and dropped off samples. And like the 3rd or 4th sample that I dropped off, the buyer, this is a bar that's no longer around in North Portland. He said, this is amazing. I'll buy, it's a funny guy, Drew. He said, I'll buy everything you have. And he knew that, that I didn't have much. Right.
Yeah.
And he was right. Cause I had like 12 half barrel kegs, which is like 12 times 15.5 gallons.
Yep.
He said, yeah, I'm going to put it on tap all summer at my bar. And this was a bar that rotated everything all the time. Every keg was different. And I had a permanent tap handle there at the bar for the summer. Yeah. And so I delivered like 3 of them on the first delivery. And then every week he'd call me and tell me how many more he needed. And that cider, that kind of grew into, there's another bar called Apex in Portland on Division and 11th. And they are another one of these 60 taps and nothing, and everything rotates, maybe 50 taps and everything rotates. And we had a permanent Hopricot handle there. And so that Hallelujah Hopricot really put us on the map in Portland. There was a pair of British writer and a photographer who came to America looking for the best ciders, and they wrote a book called World's Best Ciders. And I insisted that they try Hopricot, and they did, and they ended up adding it to their book. And their 2-sentence blurb was, sounds like the stuff of nightmares, but when you put it all together, it's a really amazing thing that we didn't expect would work out. Sadly, unfortunately, Hallelujah Hopricot is no longer being made. It's a real tragedy. The era of hopped ciders was very brief and very geographically defined by Portland, and it just didn't have legs as a permanent. We still make some hopped ciders, but Hopricot alone was just pushed out by our other more successful flavors. So I still make it once a year, mostly just for myself. It kind of moved away from being a commercially viable product for us.
Yeah, because I was going to ask when you were creating that initially before you got the feedback on it, was it sort of like when like a band or a musician like creates an album and they know the songs are good, but there's like this one song that like really does extremely well, and they're like, oh, I didn't know it would do that well. Like, but I mean, I knew it was good, but it like took on this whole life of its own. Was that sort of how the cider was, or did you know initially like it's bizarre, but I know people are really going to connect with this?
No, I mean, again, I was always making ciders for myself, and I'd be totally happy, selling 5 kegs a month or, whatever my initial business plan called for. It was extremely modest. And I certainly hoped that there'd be a couple of people who clicked with some of the ciders that I was making, and there certainly were, but I didn't have any expectation. What I didn't know was that the time and place, the one best time and place in the history of the known world to start a cider company was 2011 in Portland. There was just so many things coming together that made the class of 2011 or 2012, 2010 be a really strong class for cider making, particularly in the Northwest. And then Portland is really the epicenter of cider consumption in the Northwest. So, we had like the highest per capita consumption of cider. We had the highest non-per capita consumption of cider. We had the most cider companies in the state, most cider companies in the city. We had cider festivals that weren't being held anywhere else, and I was able to, really just look around. Early in the business, I looked around and realized, oh, I'm on the very front of this wave, and there's this huge wave behind me. So we went big quickly with events and education and staff and innovation and festivals, and we just did so many things that really. Sleepless nights, so that really kept us alive and pushed us to the forefront of cider innovation within Portland, Pacific Northwest, America, and really internationally as well. So I made friends in those early days, 13, 14, 15, that are around the world, as became known as the sort of cider, crazy cider guy that still sticks with me.
Yeah, is that still something that is prevalent today? Are there still like cider companies coming up? Is it still like the epicenter for all of that, or has that sort of fleshed out more into the United States?
Yeah, you don't want to start a cider company in Portland right now. Maybe you want to start a cider company in Portland next year. I don't really know. I don't think so. If you don't start it in Portland, by the way, because I will crush you. Start it in Seattle. Yeah. There are a lot of cider companies, any decent sized metropolitan area, even places like, I bet there's a place in like, Omaha, but there's there's a couple of cider companies in Texas, and they don't grow apples really in Texas. So, there's cider companies in Florida. Likewise, no apples being grown in Florida. So I think there's an opportunity for a cider company to be established and to, get a following anywhere in America that has a decent sort of commercial activity. Your ambitions must be put in check. There's never going to be another Angry Orchard ever. The market just will not tolerate, for many reasons, the market will not tolerate a company like that. Sure. So, can you start, a buddy of mine started a cider company 2 years ago in Astoria, Oregon. And Astoria is a relatively small seaside town. There's maybe 15 stoplights, 20 stoplights.
I was there a couple of weeks ago, actually.
Yeah, so it's really cute. It's a little touristy for sure. And there's some retirees. The Goonies was filmed there. And he opened this little cidery, about as big as my basement and garage combined was. And he put it in location. And he's got this little tiny tap room, and he works all the time, and he'll never get a retirement out of it probably, but he has a going business that's actually like, sustainable, and because of the sort of larger market dynamics, as well as the location that he's in Astoria, and the small facility that he's in, he's never going to be huge. Got to keep that kind of thing in mind as you're opening, any kind of alcohol, really, not just cider.
Talking about the cider is great. I love what you create there. But also I feel like the name is just so good. And so, but you actually are ordained, right? Like that's right. That's an actual thing.
Yeah. I got ordained to marry some friends many years ago. And that was a little bit out of the blue. I'm still friends with those folks, but I was like, okay, sure. I don't know how to do that. But you Google, becoming a minister, and probably the first hit is the Universal Life Church, and they just it's a legitimate church, right? And their only mission is to ordain ministers. 30 seconds later, click, 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 poof, you're ordained.
Yeah, how long does it take you?
For all eternity, I might remind you. There's no there's no renewal fees or anything. It takes like 5 minutes.
Okay. Wow.
It's free, and they kindly request a donation at the end, and of course, probably should. And I've done 2 weddings, and I was really getting into home cider making at the time that I was ordained. And just between you and me and whoever's listening to this, I am not a religious person by any means. Pretty devout atheist. So my friends were really, they thought it was hilarious that I was an ordained minister. So they started calling me Reverend Nat as a joke. The name stuck, and then it showed itself onto a bottle, and then here we are.
Yeah, there's something really great about Reverend Nat hard cider on like a alcoholic product. There's something good about it. Were there any other names thrown around at the time, or that one just was it?
No names. That was it. It was my friends were calling me Reverend Nat. I was staring at some Avery label to stick on my home bottles on my laser printer at home, and I just typed Reverend Nat in big block letters, and the name just stuck ever since. And even the design pretty much stuck ever since. That was some of the original designs that we brought out. I mean, I think the name is evocative, obviously, because it has sort of an old timey feel to it. And, cider in America is like pretty much the original drink of, our founding fathers and mothers. Even if you don't drink cider in America, you know what it is. Unlike some others, quote unquote, sort of alternative beverages, like a lot of people don't know what kombucha is. And I bet you could even ask people how to make cider, and the majority of them would get it right, get it roughly right. There are other languages around the world that don't have a word for cider in them. So we have a really strong history of cider in America. And I think the name Reverend Nat kind of evokes that, the tradition that we have, but also flips it all on your head when you realize that I'm not making traditional ciders either.
Yeah. And like now with having employees and distribution all over the West Coast and Japan as well, which is I read. So how did that relationship develop in getting your cider over to Japan? Yeah,
so we're sold in 10 states in the U.S., pretty much all of Canada except Quebec. We're in a few countries in Europe and in Japan. I've been selling in Japan for, I want to say 6 years.
Wow.
7 years. Very early in the business, we got hooked up in Japan, and it came about because there's this guy, and he retired from the pork import business in Japan, a Japanese guy.
Sure.
And he loves beer and American craft beer. And he started an import business of American craft beer. And he had connections already to Oregon and to Portland. And so he came over to Portland, and he talked to some people he knew. And he said, "Hey, who's making good beer that I can bring to Japan?" And so he started a Portland specific beer import business in Japan.
Wow.
And he was pretty early in I want to say like the third or fourth importer of American craft beer in Japan. And Oregon makes some of the best craft beer in the world. So he was able to bring in delicious beers, and he was a logistics guy. So he was able to get it there pretty quickly, and the beer was still fresh. And he just was, he used to come to Portland multiple times a year. And Reverend Nat's is well loved by the Portland beer community. And in a lot of ways, we are a part of the beer community, not necessarily the cider community. I think I'm very proud that if you ask lots of brewers, any brewer in Portland who makes the best cider, and 9 out of 10 will say Reverend Nat's. Whether it's true or not, it's what brewers like. Yeah. We've really aligned with the beer community. So some brewer along the way was like, "Oh, you got to go to Reverend Nat's," and he comes in the door, and his English was good enough, and I tasted him through, and his mind was blown. He didn't know anything. Japanese has no word for cider, so it was really not in his vocabulary, and he really fell in love with it and thought there was an opportunity, and started selling a lot. And then very quickly we became his largest supplier, bigger than the other breweries. And so I've managed to get over there a few times to support the young cider industry in Japan and do some events and meet some people. And it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, I actually took Japanese in high school and middle school. So I guess learning about their culture, I didn't really ever hear about any cider consumption even over there. So
sure.
Yeah.
And they grow a lot of apples. So in the beginning, years ago when I went there, we would call it ringo sake, which is apple sake or apple wine. And that was, people would go, oh, okay, I get it.
Yeah.
And then once they started to develop their own local cider community industry, some of those folks picked up the English loanword hard cider. So now we just call it hard cider. Japan, actually, culinarily, Japan has a decent connection with France. I don't really know how that happened, but there's great French food being made in Japan, and so French folks make some great wine, great cider, great wine too. So the Japanese people were importing French wines, and some cider kind of tagged along on some of those shipments. So they did have French cider, high end French cider for many years in Japan.
Sure.
But in typical French fashion, they use the word shidoru, which is sort of like high-end cider. So the local community got away from this established shidoru word because they didn't want it to come across as snooty French stuff.
Sure.
They wanted to come across as more beer-oriented. So that's why we have this hado cider came about.
Sort of getting into more like how people can connect with, even finding it in their state, out of the 10 states or Canada. Where can people find more information about Reverend Nat's?
Most of our state distributors are plugged into a little widget we have on our website, revnats.com/find. And that's like type in your zip code, a map pops up. Pretty simple little thing. Virginia doesn't feed into that system, but we're in, you can find us in higher end bottle shops and markets in Oregon, Washington, Southern California, Montana. We actually shout out to Montana, Big Sky. We do a lot of business in Montana. Colorado, Ohio, full state Ohio, west, the east side, eastern, the Front Range in Colorado. And then we're in New England, Maine, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and then Virginia, my home state, and North Carolina. That's the full wrap.
Awesome. Well, yeah, and also like social media and things, where can people find you there?
If you just type in Reverend Nats or Rev Nats anywhere, we'll pop up into all the social medias. Our tag is Rev Nats Cider on all of the platforms that we are on. And I'm personally really active on Twitter. Our Instagram is probably needs more help, but we're on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook primarily.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. I appreciate it. I really love what you guys make, so it was awesome having you on. Yeah,
it's really fun talking to you. I could talk about cider a lot, so it's good that you cut me off here.
Yeah, I mean, and just so people know, if you're going to make a cider company, do not make it in Portland, because he will crush you.
I will crush you. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Absolutely, Sam. Talk to you later.